Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome. Now, I'm going to talk about deer ecology management in native woodlands. I'm going to probably start by putting something in context. And it's really, the background is in relation to what we're not really doing that well and some of the reasons why we have problems with deer. I suppose the first thing to say really is that we're kind of hardwired to consider only the negative impacts of deer presence in native woodlands ecosystems. When we look at native woodlands and we look at deer presence, we always tend to look for the bad things that are going on. And that's not necessarily always the case, but there's good reason for it. And one of the reasons that we have this sort of approach is because there has been and continues to be a persistent failure to quantify deer productivity. And this makes it absolutely impossible to effectively reduce deer density. And also, we still insist that the default approach to solving deer problems is by simply shooting them. So where there's a problem, we just simply pull out the rifle and we say, okay, we've got to shoot these things. But we don't consider any of the underlying factors. So we're skipping a whole lot of stuff in between and we're jumping to the end game. And the final thing really is we have yet to embrace the whole concept of integrating deer ecology with managing deer at the landscape level. And what I mean by that is basically, to put this in context, we have a situation where we think we're managing deer, but we're not actually managing them at all. We're shooting lots of them, but we're not managing them. And in this is a landscape. If you can take the black line as being the landscape, and there are lots of little habitats within the landscape. These habitats are occupied by deer, and unfortunately, we have a system which is historical, where you have in the top left-hand corner, you have a hunter who's shooting deer on a farm. You have another hunter shooting deer on another farm, and then you have a group of perhaps 3 or 4 individuals hunting deer in a woodland. The difficulty with this is that all of the hunting activities are concentrating on the same deer population. So they're just moving around from one place to another. They're all being exploited by different individuals. Nobody knows what they're doing or what impacts they're having. And nobody is keeping any records and nobody's done any prior research to find out what is actually going on. So that's really where we are. Now, I'm just going to deal very briefly with the deer species that we have currently in the country. We all know the red deer. They're quite numerous, but not that numerous in actual fact. They're relatively clumped in different parts of the country. Donegal, probably Kerry, and parts of Mayo, but they're spreading into other areas as well. The fallow deer, probably the most numerous and widespread. They occupy pretty much the whole centre of the country, and they're probably the most numerous species that we have. Sika deer, again, becoming more numerous and starting to spread into parts of the country that they hadn't been before. Again, an introduced species. Now, the next two, the muntjac, this guy here, I'm not going to really talk too much about them because they're relatively recent introductions and we don't know a whole lot about them in terms of their presence and where they are in this country. And of course, the roe deer. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that basically there are huge differences between all of these species. Some of them are large, some of them are medium-sized, some of them are small. Some of them are extremely mobile. In other words, they have large home range sizes, which can be up to 1,800, 2,000 hectares. And some are quite sedentary, with home ranges as small as 50 hectares. So there's huge differences in terms of the species themselves. But one thing that they have in common is that they can all have positive, neutral, and negative effects on habitats. So what is deer ecology? Basically, there are three things. One is population dynamics. The second is resources, and by resources I mean essentially habitats and habitats that they occupy. And the third part of deer ecology is deer behaviour. So what is population dynamics? What do we mean when we talk about population dynamics? Basically, they're annual variables that occur within a deer population. So these are things that change throughout the year and over the year. Density is obviously one. We can have high density, medium density, low density. Density can increase very quickly or it can increase really slowly. And density is essentially the number of individuals per unit area. The second thing is reproduction and recruitment, and these are often mixed up. People often refer to reproductive rates and when they're actually talking about recruitment rates. Reproduction is simply the percentage of females that are pregnant in any population in a given year. Recruitment is completely different. Recruitment is actually the number of, or the percentage of individuals that manage to survive to the age of 1 year. So there's quite a difference. The other thing is population structure, and that is simply the ratio of males to females, females to yearlings, and yearlings to calves. And in there also is age structure. So they're things that we need to pay attention to. And obviously mortality. And mortality can be human-induced mortality or it can be natural. So, and that is something that again, needs to be taken into account. So this graphic, basically, this is a population of sika deer that I studied in Killarney over 12 years. And basically what happened was we stopped shooting for 12 years, simply to see what the response of the population would be. And we were able to monitor it really closely for that period of time. And the top line shows the increase in female density from year 1 to year 12. So it started around 15 deer per 100 hectares and climbed right up to just below 60 deer per 100 hectares. The yellow line in the middle is this one here, is the density of calves. And as you can see, slightly lower, but they also rose in tandem with the density of hinds. The bottom line, the green line, is actually the density of stags. And they stayed pretty much the same for the whole 12 years. In actual fact, they started to decline slightly, probably as a result of increasing hind density. But this is just to show you how changes within a population can occur. And this is, shows the reproductive and recruitment rates that I was talking about earlier. The top line is the percentage of females pregnant in the population. And that averaged around 80% for almost the entire 12 years. It started to drop off in the final couple of years, which was fairly well expected. The middle line basically is the number of surviving offspring in December of the following year. And about 40% of the offspring actually survived. And the bottom line, the one in blue, is the number of individuals, juveniles, that actually survived at the end of the period. And basically, the reproductive rate, if you were to go by the reproductive rate, you would think, well, 80% reproductive rate is really high, but the recruitment rate actually averaged out at about 26%. So the big difference from the top to the bottom. So now I just want to show you how landscape habitat use varies between summer and winter, and also between different species. And again, the differences are quite subtle, but nonetheless, they're important. And it just shows how animals use the landscape. And within that landscape, they will actually use different habitats at different levels throughout the year. So you can see the difference in habitat use between red deer and, in winter and summertime. There are a lot of similarities, but there are also discrete differences. So it's important that those are understood. Similarly, for sika deer, a completely different picture in terms of habitat use to red deer, which is very important, which shows that there's difference between species. And the difference between winter and summer is not that marked. It's not quite as marked as it would be with red deer. So in relation to diet, most deer species are preferential grazers. Diet changes seasonally, and the quality and abundance can have a profound effect on deer body weight and condition. And of course, this affects reproductive performance, productivity, and survival. And this just shows the differences in seasonal intake of grasses. This is between red and sika deer, and you can see the sika actually tend to eat more grasses than red deer. And this is also the intake of heaths and woody species. Again, differences between red and sika deer. And behaviour. Behaviour is obviously affected by a number of factors. There are distinct interspecific differences in behaviour. So all species react differently to different inputs. And disturbance, and particularly shooting, can modify behaviour enormously. And very often it can modify behaviour permanently. And many management prescriptions that we're likely to undertake are going to be influenced by changes in behavioural patterns. So this really demonstrates the complexity of deer management and deer ecology and how it's all interconnected. And we tend to, at the moment, we tend to ignore all of this stuff here, and we tend to look at impacts and control. We just deal with two parts of it, and we ignore the rest. And that really needs to change. So what we need to do now is we need to start setting realistic and achievable objectives. So we need to start planning what we do and how we intend to undertake it. We need to learn to interpret the landscape, composition, and predicted changes over time. So we have to start looking at possible habitat modelling. We need to understand population dynamics, as we've just seen, and the likely predicted changes that they are going to happen over time. And also, we need to take an objective ecosystems approach to the collection, analysis, and application of critical data. And what does this critical data actually mean? There are bits of information that we have to collect that are absolutely essential in order to manage deer properly. The first of these is to assess the habitat composition and structure. The second is to identify patterns of deer habitat use, so that to know what's going on with the landscape, within the landscape, we have to know what the animals are actually doing and how they're behaving. We need to quantify impacts objectively. There's a lot of subjective analysis of impacts, and that needs to change. And we need to assess the need for protection in the form of fencing, or perhaps look at alternative management strategies. We need to quantify annual recruitment. We need to estimate abundance, determine annual mortality, and of course modify the level of population control accordingly. So to summarize, basically, in order to be successful, deer management in native woodlands requires a profound understanding of deer ecology and the dynamics that exist between deer and their habitat. Without that, really, we're going absolutely nowhere. Also, a paradigm shift is required in our attitude, approach, and application to the principles of deer management. We're not doing any of that at the moment, unfortunately. We're just simply shooting deer and then convincing ourselves that we're managing them. We must learn also to be proactive rather than reactive. We're constantly reacting to problems, and very often reacting to problems creates more problems rather than solves the ones we're trying to solve. And this can really only be achieved through the process of deer management planning. So we have to start thinking about actually writing deer management plans and setting objectives, because that means we're tied in to actually trying to achieve particular goals. And finally, if we don't do any of this, the effective long-term solutions to issues of deer overabundance will continue to be elusive. Thank you for your attention.